Welcome to Revenge with Roman, the place where betrayal meets justice. Today's story is one of the deepest cuts a man can ever endure. Humiliation not from an enemy, but from the woman he trusted most. Imagine the sting of hearing the person you vowed to share a life with compare you to your own blood, mocking, taunting, and shattering every ounce of pride you carry. But in the shadows of pain, there is always a chance for payback. When love turns into betrayal and betrayal into rage, revenge becomes the only answer. This is not just a story about heartbreak. It's about a calculated plan, a dangerous trap, and the unexpected fallout that no one saw coming. The night had started like so many others, with small sparks of irritation that seemed harmless at first, but quickly built into flames neither of them could control. Ethan Miller sat across from his wife at the dinner table, the remnants of a half-eaten meal between them, his fork clinking against the plate as he tried to swallow down both food and frustration. The tension had been growing for weeks, invisible walls building between them, and tonight those walls finally cracked. His wife Claire had been scrolling on her phone, her disinterest cutting into him more than any insult could. He asked her a simple question, something about why she was so distant lately, but instead of an honest answer, she gave him a laugh, cold, sharp, dismissive. That laugh dug under his skin, igniting something raw inside him. Words flew back and forth, each one sharper than the last. Until suddenly, without warning, she unleashed the one sentence that would forever change his life. "You know, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "your brother is better than you, especially in bed." The silence that followed was deafening. The clatter of his fork falling to the table was the only sound, but even that seemed muffled by the pounding in his ears. For a moment, Ethan thought he had misheard her, that maybe the rage had twisted her words into something unthinkable. But her eyes, those cold, unflinching eyes, told him she meant every syllable. Time froze around him, every detail etched into his memory. The flicker of the candle on the table, the way she leaned back in her chair with a cruel smirk, the faint clink of her wine glass as she raised it, savoring his silence like a victory. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. He felt as though the floor beneath him had given way and he was falling, tumbling into a void where nothing made sense anymore. The woman he had trusted, loved, and built a life with had just compared him to his own brother in the most intimate, degrading way possible. It wasn't just a confession, it was an attack, a knife driven deep into his pride and twisted for cruelty. Ethan's first instinct was to lash out, to shout, to demand answers, but something inside him held back. He could feel the rage boiling, yet it didn't explode. It simmered, cold and calculating. As she watched him, expecting him to crumble or beg, he remained quiet. His silence unnerved her, and for a fleeting second he saw doubt flicker in her eyes. That tiny crack in her confidence planted a seed in his mind. If she thought this was a game, if she thought her words could break him, she had no idea what he was capable of when pushed too far. But in that moment, he also couldn't stop the flood of memories that hit him. Memories of his brother Daniel laughing with him over beers, helping him move into this very house, being the best man at his wedding. The betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't just Claire who had spat on their marriage vows. It was his own blood who had crossed the line. Ethan replayed family dinners in his mind. The casual glances, the inside jokes, the moments that now seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Every smile, every look between Claire and Daniel suddenly twisted into something sinister. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to breathe. His hands trembled under the table, but he clenched them into fists until his knuckles whitened, masking the storm brewing inside. Claire, emboldened by his silence, leaned forward and added with a cruel edge, "Maybe if you were half the man he is, I wouldn't need to look elsewhere." The words hit like bullets, tearing through the last shred of his dignity. But instead of breaking him, they forged something far more dangerous. In that instant, Ethan made a choice. He wouldn't confront her with raw anger. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him shattered. Instead, he would let her believe she had won, let her bask in her arrogance, let her dig her own grave with her careless cruelty. He realized that the worst kind of revenge isn't immediate. It's slow, deliberate, and devastating. She wanted to humiliate him, to strip him of his pride, but she had no idea she had just awakened a side of him she had never seen before. He pushed his chair back slowly, his movements calm, almost deliberate, as if her words hadn't cut him at all. Inside he was burning, but outside he gave her nothing. The smirk on her lips widened. mistaking his restraint for weakness, and that only fueled the icy fire in his veins. Ethan looked at her one last time across the table, memorizing every detail of her smug face before turning away. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, he simply walked out of the room, each step heavy with the weight of betrayal and the birth of something much darker. What Claire didn't realize was that in her attempt to destroy him, she had handed him the perfect weapon, knowledge. And knowledge, when combined with rage and betrayal, is the deadliest weapon of all. The hours after that fight felt like a blur, but every second was etched into Ethan's memory like scars carved into stone. He sat alone in the darkness of his living room, the faint ticking of the wall clock mocking the silence that pressed down on him. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison filled with shadows of betrayal. His mind replayed her words over and over, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. "Your brother is better than you, especially in bed." The venom in her voice, the smirk that accompanied it, the satisfaction she took in breaking him, it all churned in his stomach until humiliation became unbearable. But humiliation has two faces. For a time it crushed him, making him feel small, insignificant, stripped of every ounce of manhood and pride he had carried. He thought about how the world must see him now, his wife mocking him, his brother taking what was his, and him sitting powerless in the ruins of their betrayal. That was the first face of humiliation, the sting of shame. But as the night wore on and his mind spiraled deeper into the abyss, the second face began to emerge. It wasn't shame anymore. It was fire. A slow-burning, icy fire that hardened his humiliation into something unrecognizable. Determination. Ethan stared at his reflection in the black screen of the television, the faint glow from the streetlight outside catching the sharp lines of his jaw. His eyes looked hollow, but behind them something new was forming. He whispered the words to himself just to taste them. They will pay. For the first time since Claire's confession, he felt a strange calmness, as though the storm inside him had shifted into focus. He wasn't going to beg for answers. He wasn't going to demand explanations. No, he was going to make them choke on their lies, expose them for what they were, and ensure they lost everything they had tried to take from him. He thought about Daniel, his brother, his flesh and blood. Growing up, they had always been close, but there had always been a subtle undercurrent of competition between them. Ethan remembered the way Daniel had always seemed to outshine him, whether it was sports in high school, charm at parties, or success in his career. But Ethan had never resented him. Not really. He had been proud to call him brother, proud enough to ignore the little slights, the jokes, the way people sometimes compared them. But now those old comparisons burned like acid. Claire's words didn't just reveal an affair. They unearthed years of buried insecurities, all brought to the surface in one devastating blow. As he sat there, humiliation twisting into resolve, Ethan began to think carefully. Rage demanded he confront them both right away, but rage alone wasn't enough. If he lashed out now, he'd look desperate, broken, and she would win. No, he needed to bide his time. He needed to be smarter, colder. A trap wasn't built in a night. It was woven strand by strand until the prey walked into it willingly, blind to the danger until it was too late. That was how he would destroy them. The quiet of the house was broken only by the creak of the stairs when Claire finally went up to bed. Ethan didn't follow. He stayed downstairs staring at the glowing embers in the fireplace, watching them crackle and die. There was symbolism in that. The fire that once burned bright between them was gone, but in its place a darker flame had been lit within him. He realized that Claire must believe he was too weak to act, too broken to fight back. Her arrogance would be her downfall. He would let her believe that. He would play the role of the wounded husband, the one who swallowed his pride and looked the other way. And while she grew careless, while Daniel grew confident, Ethan would be preparing. Every betrayal has its tipping point, the moment where the victim decides whether to remain broken or to rise from the ashes with vengeance in hand. For Ethan, that moment had arrived. The humiliation had cut him down to his core, but now it was forging him into someone new. The Ethan who once trusted blindly, who once loved without suspicion, was gone. In his place was a man sharpened by betrayal, fueled by anger, and guided by an unwavering determination to reclaim his pride in the most devastating way possible. The night stretched on, and though exhaustion pulled at his body, his mind refused to rest. He began to plan, not fully, not yet, but the first seeds took root. How could he catch them? How could he force them into the open? Strip away their lies and make sure there was no escape. He pictured the look on Claire's face when her smugness collapsed into fear. The shock in Daniel's eyes when he realized the trap had closed around him. The thought gave him strength, a twisted sense of hope. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, Ethan was no longer the same man who had sat shattered at the dinner table. The humiliation still lingered, but it no longer crushed him. Instead, it fueled him, a constant reminder of why he couldn't stop, why he couldn't forgive. Claire thought she had broken him. Daniel thought his betrayal would stay hidden. But neither of them understood what Ethan was capable of once he set his mind on something. The following days became a masquerade of normalcy for Ethan, though nothing inside him felt normal anymore. He moved through his routines with a calmness so convincing that even Claire, sharp as she was, didn't seem to notice the shift in his eyes. He smiled when she spoke, nodded at her excuses for late returns, even kissed her cheek when she left the house. But behind the mask, his mind was working like a machine, calculating, observing, piecing together every inconsistency. He had made a vow to himself on that night of humiliation. If she dared to betray him with his own brother, he would not rest until he had proof so undeniable that no denial could save them. At first, he started small. He paid attention to her phone habits, the way she tilted the screen away from him, how her fingers danced quickly across the keypad when a message came in. Sometimes he caught her smiling faintly at the screen, the kind of smile she used to reserve for him. Every flicker of emotion, every shadow in her eyes he catalogued in silence. He even began noting the times she stepped into the backyard to take calls, or the extra effort she suddenly put into her appearance on days when she claimed she was meeting friends. But suspicion wasn't enough. Ethan needed evidence, so he quietly began to set things in motion. Late at night, when Claire was asleep, he bought a second phone online, a burner untraceable, something he could use without her knowing. He ordered a discreet camera small enough to fit into the corner of their bedroom, just in case he ever needed to catch her red-handed. But his instincts told him that Claire was too cunning to risk anything so close to home. No, she would meet Daniel elsewhere, in places they thought were safe, invisible. That meant Ethan had to widen his net. Daniel, on the other hand, was easier to watch. He had always been predictable. Ethan knew his work schedule, the gym he went to, even the bar he favored on Friday nights. It wasn't hard to shadow him without being noticed. Just a car parked 2 blocks away, a hat pulled low, a pair of sunglasses. Ethan felt the humiliation harden into determination each time he watched his brother walk freely, living his life as though he hadn't betrayed the deepest bond a man could ever betray. It disgusted him, but it also fueled him. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday evening. Claire had said she was meeting her friend Amanda for dinner, claiming it had been too long since they'd caught up. But Amanda, as Ethan already knew from a carefully crafted excuse to call her, was out of town on business for the entire week. That lie was all he needed to confirm the depth of her deceit. Instead of confronting her, he followed. He parked far enough behind her car that she wouldn't notice, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes never leaving her taillights. When she finally pulled into a hotel parking lot on the edge of town, his chest tightened. The sight of Daniel's car already there made his blood run cold. He didn't storm in. That would have been too easy, too reckless. Instead, he watched, memorizing every detail, committing their crime to memory. He took photos, grainy at first, then clearer as he adjusted. Each click of the camera on his phone another nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. He saw them step out together later, Claire's hair tousled, Daniel's shirt slightly wrinkled, both of them laughing as though their betrayal was the most natural thing in the world. Ethan's hands trembled so violently on the steering wheel that he had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from driving straight into them. Back home, he sat in the dark once again, scrolling through the photos, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. There it was, proof. Proof that Claire had not only betrayed him, but had done so with the one person who should have been untouchable. But instead of breaking him further, the evidence steadied him. This was no longer suspicion. It was fact. And with fact came power. Over the next week, Ethan's quiet investigation expanded. He tracked their patterns, the days and times they met, the lies she fed him, the excuses Daniel gave their parents about being busy with work. He built a map of their betrayal, A timeline so detailed that it read like a confession in itself. Every lie they told was another string he could pull later. Every secret rendezvous another weapon in his growing arsenal. What neither of them realized was that Ethan was no longer a passive victim. He wasn't the man sitting at the dinner table crushed by humiliation. He had become something else entirely. A man who saw every move, heard every lie, and stored it all away for the perfect moment. And when that moment came, when the trap was ready to snap shut, the devastation would be absolute. Ethan knew that gathering proof was only half the battle. A pile of photos and a timeline of lies could destroy a marriage, but that wasn't enough. Claire had humiliated him in the cruelest way possible, and Daniel had betrayed him in a way no brother ever should. If Ethan wanted to strike back, it couldn't just be with evidence. It had to be with a trap so devastating, so undeniable, that both of them would be exposed in front of everyone who mattered. Quietly ending things wouldn't satisfy the fire burning in his chest. They needed to feel the same humiliation he had endured, magnified 100 times. He spent sleepless nights sketching out plans in his head, every detail a piece of a larger puzzle. It wasn't enough to confront them in private. That would let them twist the story, cover it with lies, maybe even paint him as the jealous husband. No, he had to strike in a way that left no room for excuses. The truth had to explode in their faces, and it had to happen when they least expected it. The first step was control. Ethan started acting softer toward Claire, almost apologetic, as though her cruel words had finally broken him. He made her believe he was trying harder, offering to cook dinner, complimenting her appearance, even suggesting they take a weekend trip to rekindle what they had lost. Claire, convinced of her own superiority, seemed smug with his efforts, taking them as signs of weakness. She laughed more freely, lied more boldly, thinking she had total control of the situation. She had no idea that every laugh, every excuse was being fed back into Ethan's growing plan. For Daniel, Ethan played the role of brother as convincingly as ever. He called him up, suggested a beer, even talked about old times, all while resisting the urge to smash the bottle across his skull. Daniel looked relaxed, unbothered, smug in a way Ethan had never noticed before. It infuriated him, but he stayed calm. He needed Daniel to believe that nothing had changed between them, that his betrayal was still hidden beneath layers of secrecy. With their guards lowered, Ethan set the real trap in motion. He began recording phone calls, Claire's excuses when she said she'd be late, the slips in her tone when she claimed to be meeting Amanda or staying late at work. He planted a hidden voice recorder in her car, knowing that sooner or later, Daniel's voice would slip into the open. He wasn't wrong. One night, as he sifted through the recordings, his stomach clenched when he heard it. Claire laughing softly, Daniel's voice low and intimate, both of them speaking words that stripped away any illusion of innocence. That file alone could end everything, but Ethan didn't stop there. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the truth unveiled in front of family, friends, maybe even strangers. So he waited until his parents announced a family dinner at their home, something they hadn't done in months. Everyone would be there, his parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and of course Daniel. Claire would have no excuse not to attend. As the day drew closer, Ethan rehearsed the scene in his mind. The moment when laughter turned to silence, when smug faces turned pale, when lies collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. In preparation, he created a slideshow on his laptop, carefully arranging photos of hotel meetings, screenshots of texts, audio clips of stolen conversations. He made sure every piece of evidence flowed seamlessly into the next, each one hitting harder than the last. By the time it ended, there would be no way out for them. No denial, no forgiveness, just destruction. On the day of the dinner, Ethan dressed sharply, his face calm, his voice steady. Inside, his chest throbbed with the force of his heartbeat, but he showed nothing. Claire was radiant that evening, smiling, laughing, playing the role of perfect wife. Daniel clapped him on the back when they arrived, wearing the grin of a man too sure of his secret. It took every ounce of Ethan's self-control not to let his rage spill out right there, but the trap was set. The stage was ready. As dinner unfolded, conversation and laughter filled the room, oblivious to the storm waiting to break. Ethan waited until the plates were cleared, until everyone was settled with drinks before standing. He thanked his parents for bringing everyone together, his voice warm and steady. Then, with the calmness of a man who had planned this moment to perfection, He pulled out his laptop and said there was something important he needed to share. The room fell silent as the screen flickered to life. At first, there were puzzled looks, then widened eyes as the first photo appeared, Claire and Daniel stepping out of the hotel. A hush fell across the room, thick and heavy. Claire's smile faltered. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Ethan said nothing, letting the evidence speak for itself. The photos flowed into texts, then into the audio recording. Daniel's voice unmistakable, Claire's laughter undeniable. Every gasp from the family was like fuel to Ethan's fire. He stood tall, his hands steady, as the trap snapped shut around them. By the time the slideshow ended, the silence was suffocating. Claire's face was pale, her lips trembling, while Daniel stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Ethan had orchestrated it perfectly. There was no defense, no way out. Everyone in that room now knew the truth, and there was no taking it back. The room hung heavy with silence after the final slide disappeared from the screen. For a heartbeat, it felt as if time itself had stopped. Every eye in the room darting between Ethan, Claire, and Daniel. The laughter and warmth from moments ago were gone, replaced by a suffocating tension that wrapped around everyone like a vice. Ethan could hear the faint clinking of a fork against a plate, someone shifting uncomfortably in their chair, the shallow breaths of his mother as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. Claire was the first to break. "Ethan," she stammered, her voice trembling, her hands reaching out as though she could physically push the truth away. This isn't what it looks like." Her words sounded pitiful, hollow, a desperate attempt to weave a lie out of shreds too torn to hold. Her face, once so smug and superior, was now pale, her eyes wide with panic. The confidence she had wielded like a weapon days before was gone. Stripped from her in a single blow, Daniel shifted beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between Ethan and the shocked faces of their family. His usual cocky grin was nowhere to be found. Instead, sweat beaded at his temple, his fists clenching under the table. "Ethan, come on," he muttered, his voice low, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. This is private. We don't need to do this here." His words only deepened the silence, the implication itself enough to confirm what everyone already knew. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. He stood tall, his gaze locked on them both, the calmness of his voice cutting sharper than any scream could. "Private?" he repeated, his tone dripping with quiet venom. "You two thought you could humiliate me in secret. You thought I wouldn't find out. But betrayal like this doesn't stay buried. It deserves to be seen." His father's face was red with fury, his fists trembling against the table. "Daniel," he barked, his voice cracking with rage, "tell me this isn't true." But Daniel couldn't answer. His silence was an admission louder than any words. Gasps rippled through the room, his mother pressing a hand to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. The betrayal wasn't just Ethan's to bear now, it belonged to the entire family, and the shame of it spread like wildfire. Claire's panic turned to desperation. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. "Ethan, please," she cried, her voice high, broken. "It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking. I never meant to hurt you like this." Her hands trembled as she reached for him, but Ethan stepped back, his face unreadable. The distance between them was more than physical. It was a chasm carved by every lie, every stolen moment, every cruel word she had thrown at him. Daniel finally found his voice, though it was rough, strained. "Ethan, He trailed off, his throat tightening, shame radiating from him like heat. He had always been the golden child, the one who charmed everyone, but in that moment he looked small, pathetic, crushed under the weight of his own choices. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered, though the words rang false even to his own ears. Ethan let the silence after those words hang, let it fester, let it burn. He scanned the faces around the room, the disbelief, the anger, the disappointment etched into every expression. This was the moment he had built toward, the moment where their betrayal could no longer be hidden behind lies. He had imagined it for weeks, replayed it in his mind, and now, standing in the middle of it, he felt a grim satisfaction settle into his chest. "You both made your choices," Ethan said finally, his voice steady, his eyes piercing through them like steel. "You thought you could betray me and walk away unscathed. But betrayal has consequences, and tonight you get to face them." His words hung heavy in the air, final and damning. Claire crumpled into her chair, her face buried in her hands as sobs shook her shoulders. The reality of her downfall had hit her full force. No amount of pleading could erase the images seared into everyone's minds. No words could undo the recordings they had heard. Daniel remained standing, frozen, staring at Ethan as though searching for some kind of mercy that would never come. The family erupted then, not in chaos but in a wave of whispers, gasps, murmurs that filled the silence like static. Cousins exchanged looks of disbelief. Aunts shook their heads, uncles muttered under their breath. Ethan's father rose to his feet, towering over Daniel with fury blazing in his eyes. "You shame this family," he spat, his voice trembling. "You shame yourself. Get out." Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. He turned his gaze to Ethan, but all he saw was cold resolve. Ethan didn't need to say anything more. The evidence had already spoken and the trap had already closed. Claire, still sobbing, tried once more. "Ethan, please," she begged, her voice cracking, raw with desperation. "Don't do this. We can fix it. I love you, But Ethan cut her off with a single look, a look so sharp and unyielding that it silenced her completely. Every face at the table bore witness to the moment. The unraveling of two people who thought they could play with fire and never get burned. But Ethan had made sure the flames consumed them completely, leaving them exposed, raw, and powerless. The night of the family dinner ended in chaos, but the true aftermath began the following morning. Ethan woke to a silence in his home so heavy it pressed against his chest. Claire hadn't returned after storming out in tears, and he hadn't expected her to. He sat at the edge of the bed, the sheets cold and untouched on her side, staring at the faint glow of dawn creeping through the curtains. For the first time in weeks, there was no gnawing uncertainty. He had answers now. He had truth. But truth came with its own weight, and the consequences of what he'd unleashed were only beginning to take shape. Word spread quickly through the family. By noon the next day, his phone was flooded with messages, some from relatives offering support, others expressing shock, and a few, shamefully, trying to soften the blow by excusing Daniel's actions. Ethan ignored them all. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It had fractured the family to its core. His mother called in tears, her voice trembling as she begged him not to cut ties completely. But even she couldn't hide the anger in her tone when she spoke of Daniel. His father, stoic and hard, said little more than, "You did what you had to do, son." That was all Ethan needed to hear. Claire finally showed up 3 days later. She looked nothing like the woman who had once smirked across the dinner table, confident in her cruelty. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hair unkempt, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of her shame had finally broken her. She begged at the door, her words tumbling over each other. Desperate promises of change, excuses about loneliness and mistakes and confusion. Ethan listened in silence, his hand resting on the edge of the doorframe. For a fleeting moment, he almost felt pity. Almost. But then he remembered the sting of her voice that night, the smugness, the cruelty, the deliberate way she had twisted the knife, and his pity hardened into steel. He closed the door on her without a word, the sound of the lock clicking echoing through the hall like the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. Daniel's downfall came just as swiftly. His job, once secure, suddenly became shaky as whispers of his betrayal reached colleagues. Family members stopped answering his calls. Old friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the storm of his shame. Even their parents, who had once celebrated his every achievement, looked at him with nothing but disappointment. He tried to reach Ethan once, sending a message filled with half-hearted apologies and pleas for forgiveness. But Ethan deleted it without reading past the first line. Forgiveness was a luxury neither Daniel nor Claire would ever earn. For Ethan, the days that followed were not easy. He carried a heaviness inside him, a scar that no revenge could erase. Nights were long, haunted by the memory of what he had lost. But alongside the pain there was something else, clarity. He no longer questioned his worth, no longer allowed himself to be defined by someone else's betrayal. The humiliation that had once burned him alive had transformed into resolve, and the trap he had set had not only exposed the truth, but had freed him from the chains of a toxic marriage and a false brotherhood. Slowly he began to rebuild. He poured himself into work, into the quiet rituals of daily life, into moments that were entirely his own. Friends who truly cared stood by him, offering laughter when the silence grew too heavy, reminding him that he was not alone. His parents, though wounded by the fracture between their sons, gave him unwavering support. The family dinners that once included Daniel and Claire became gatherings where their absence was felt, but not mourned. Their names became ghosts, spoken rarely, remembered only as warnings of betrayal too deep to forgive. Ethan changed too. He was no longer the man who sat humiliated at the dinner table, crushed under his wife's cruel words. He was no longer the brother who blindly trusted blood to mean loyalty. He had become something sharper, stronger, a man who understood that trust must be earned and once broken could never be restored. The trap he had set had done more than expose a betrayal. It had burned away illusions, leaving behind a clarity he had never known before. And yet, in the quiet moments when the house was still and the world outside moved on, Ethan sometimes thought back to the night Claire first said those words. The humiliation had been unbearable, but without it, he would never have uncovered the truth. Without it, he would still be living a lie. That thought gave him peace, a grim sort of gratitude for the pain that had forced him to open his eyes. The aftermath of that night had changed everything. His marriage, his family, his very sense of self. But in that change, Ethan found something he hadn't expected. Freedom. The trap he set hadn't just destroyed Claire and Daniel. It had set him free from both of them once and for all.